Hi, good morning everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. This event is one of a series of webinars that we are now running on a weekly basis, usually at this time on a Thursday, but they will change as per our topics. So please do get in touch if you're interested in attending any future webinars. Today we're going to be discussing those looking at making an application to Oxford or Cambridge and how they might best use the time provided by lockdown to make the best start on their preparation for that application. And I'm really delighted to be joined today by David Hargreaves and Jenny McGowan, who are going to be answering the questions today. A very brief introduction to both. David worked at Westminster School for 28 years, where he was housemaster and head of sixth form. Since leaving Westminster in 2014, he has worked as an independent consultant and has worked with hundreds of families, both in the UK and overseas. He's been very good at helping us in the past with our Queen's Club events, and we're delighted to have him today for his first webinar with us. So thank you, David. And Jenny is Keystone's Director of Asia, based in Hong Kong. She oversees all of our offices in Asia and has built up an extensive knowledge of the school system and how best to support families who are looking to transition over to the UK for school or university. So really pleased to have you both here today, and we're just going to go through quite a structured sort of step-by-step questions regarding Oxbridge applications, but anyone who's listening can ask questions using the chat box, which we'll try to get to. If they're slightly more specific to the individual, then we might go to them after the webinar, but we will do our best to answer everyone's questions. We've also got a quick poll that we would love you to answer, if possible, just to give us a sense of whether there's more people looking at Oxford or Cambridge, or whether you're still not quite sure. So please do answer that when you can. So I'm just going to get straight into it, really, because I'm aware that we don't have endless amounts of time. And I just thought it would be really helpful, Jenny, if we could start with a very brief outline of the Oxbridge application timeline and the different components required when applying to Oxbridge.
Yes, of course. So hi everyone. So I'm Jenny, as Harriet kindly introduced me. So I was going to kind of give an overview of the timeline based on year 12 students. So the students that would be applying kind of this autumn to start in 2021. But of course, if you're in year kind of 10 or 11, maybe, then you just need to kind of add a couple of years onto that process. So the deadline for kind of applying for Oxbridge is the 15th of October this coming autumn. And all applications for all UK universities are done through UCAS, which is an organisation that manages applying to all different universities. You can apply to 5 universities in the UK, one of which can be Oxford or Cambridge. So you cannot apply to both, you can only apply to one. And a lot of it's administrative to start with. So when you apply through UCAS, you put in your personal details, your previous qualifications, so things like GCSEs. You also put in what you're studying at the moment. You put in your 5 choices, so which universities and courses you're applying to, and you write a personal statement explaining why you have applied for that course at these universities. In addition, your school will write a reference for you, and they will give you predicted grades. So they're saying what they think you will get in your current qualifications, whether that's A-levels, IB, or an international alternative. So that's the kind of administrative side. And then after that, Oxford and Cambridge, because they get so many amazing applicants with all the academic credentials already, they have further selection criteria. And actually, most of this is what we're going to cover today. So most courses, not all of them, will have some sort of admissions assessment. So they will be assessing you kind of based on which course you've applied for. Oxford do most of theirs pre-interview, so many of that is in November the 4th this year, whereas Cambridge do about half of their admission assessments around the same time, but equally they do another half kind of at interview assessments as well. So there's normally an admissions assessment, but not for all courses. And do check the dates for those, because they are slightly different depending on what course you're applying for. After that, the universities will then shortlist for an interview, and the interviews take place in December. And for Oxford, you normally go to Oxford. They do some on Skype. Cambridge do also interview in different cities around the world, even though whether that will happen in 2020 is to be confirmed. And then in January, you would find out whether you had the offer or not. So we're May now, the application goes in October, assessments will be in November, interview December, and then you'll find out in January. And most of what we're going to talk about for the rest of the webinar kind of talks about these different components.
Thanks, Jenny. We do actually have a timeline for university entry, so I don't know whether we can share that on the chat, but we will do so at some point in this talk or afterwards. Just so you both know that the results of the poll are in, and we have a slightly higher number of Oxford applicants, and then quite a few who are undecided. So obviously we're going to cover both anyway, but just so you're aware, when you're answering questions, it's like slightly more people are looking at Oxford. I will get to you, David, just one more question for Jenny before. Obviously, schools in Hong Kong have been closed for even longer than those in the UK, so you're probably pretty aware of how teachers have been dealing with that, and students as well. Now that schools are closed, what can people do to help their predicted A-level IB grades and school reference, given that they're not having that face-to-face interaction with their teachers?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, ultimately they should be continuing as they normally would. So presumably, if you're thinking of applying to Oxford or Cambridge, that's because your school and your teachers have endorsed that, and they actually think you're a kind of viable candidate. So in theory, your predicted grades are on track to be high enough anyway, but you need to continue with your schoolwork, continue being in touch with teachers to make sure that your predicted grades are as good as they can be, and also that your reference will be as supportive as it can be as well. And then additionally to that, the other good reason to stay in touch with school is the administrative bits. So when do they want drafts of your personal statement? When is their internal deadline? Because many schools will ask you to submit all the different components of your UCAS form, you know, in advance of October 15th, because they need to add their bit. So it's essentially just staying in touch with schools to make sure that everything is in place as you would be doing if you were there.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, David, I've got a bit of a tricky question for you here to kick things off. But could you try to summarise what it is exactly that Oxbridge are looking for?
In a phrase, they're looking for students who have an informed and reasoned commitment to their chosen subject. There's quite a lot actually in a single phrase like that, because a student who wants to study at either of those universities for a particular subject, they're going to be selected not exclusively but overwhelmingly on the basis of their potential to study that subject in such a way that they can get full advantage of those two extraordinary universities. It's not enough. I'm not dissing competence, but it's not enough just to be competent. That's why it's more. I mean, Jenny's given an absolutely faultless outline of the process, but she and I both know it's about more than process. You know, you need to have a really strong relationship with that subject. And obviously A-levels or IB or pre-U or whatever the examinations are, and your GCSEs in the past, or the equivalent examinations, all of these are a great indication of competence, but they're wanting to see potential as well. And not even just potential to get a high degree, that's all important. It's actually, do you think and mind about this subject enough? That's what I think it's about.
And a sort of question that leads on from that, because obviously these are strong candidates, as Jenny says. If they're looking at going there, they will be endorsed by the school. They will be expecting top grades. They will have achieved very good GCSEs already. How should they apply? How should students look to decide which course to apply for?
Is that for me? Is that for me, Harriet? Yeah. I think it begins with the course. Human nature being what it is, it's like looking at a lovely house. You know, you see an ideal house and you think, well, I want to live there, and then you forget it's 400 miles from where you go to work. You know, we're all capable of losing our hearts. And understandably, people are attracted for any range of reasons by Oxford and Cambridge. But it does begin with the course. How they actually work out, is this the right course? It begins with a very, very, I think, robust kind of self-examination in which both parents and teachers obviously have a huge part to play. But it has to be accompanied by realism. I used to have a little bit of a fantasy when I was about, I don't know, early teenager, that I'd like to do medicine, until it became clear to me that I really wasn't nearly good enough at chemistry and the relevant sciences. I didn't have those talents. Now, I don't think I was a great loss to the world of medicine, but when you start thinking about how you're going to, what is it you really like? I think for many people, I don't know what Jenny thinks, but and in your clients, but I think for many people there is broadly quite a strong and often clear division between those who are interested in arts and humanities, who like writing and reading, and basically their unit of currency is unit of exchange is words and surrounding and the ideas. And it's not an absolute, but those who also, or rather those who actually incline first and foremost to the sciences and or maths. I think there is a close relationship between science and maths. And that's the first of the narrowing down stages, but it goes a lot further and faster than that. But it requires realism by the candidate. And it requires that realism to be supported by the parents and by the school.
Great, thank you. Jenny, do you have anything to add on that note?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of course, I think it's similar to what David has said, really. So I think it's almost kind of within you what course you want to study. And I think, I have a lot of conversations with people who want to be statistical about it, and they want to apply for a certain course because they see it has a lower, rejection rate than others. But ultimately, it's about the course that you genuinely are interested in. So starting with things like, what do you like most at school? What are your A-level IB subjects? And looking at your favourite and what you're passionate about. And I think then going from there is a great place to start.
Harriet, can I just say very quickly on that? The liking bit, the favourite bit, so true, but it's not like liking cream cakes or Cadbury's cream eggs. It's a much rougher hewn relationship. It's a more considered relationship. I did my first degree in history and loved it deeply and dearly, but it wasn't that every day I sat down with a song on my lips to write 25 pages of notes or whatever it was. The point is, it's an ongoing, complicated, but ultimately sustaining appreciation for what you're studying.
Brilliant, thank you. And I just wanted to move on to, obviously, Jenny, you're probably seeing this quite a lot as well, being overseas, but, people may not know much about Oxford and Cambridge actually as places. And how would they choose, which one they prefer if they can't go to an open day? What would you suggest that people do to kind of research the universities and the colleges?
Yeah, so firstly, just on the open day part, is that actually Cambridge have turned all of their open days virtual. So actually they've kept the same open days as they would normally have, but they're doing them virtually. And actually on their website, there is a kind of registration link for that. And Oxford have said they are working on online resources. So that might also appear at some point as well. So for the open days, yes, you can't visit, but both universities are working on alternatives for that. I think in terms of choosing between Oxford and Cambridge, as David has said, it comes down to course again. So the course should drive which of those universities you're applying to. Now, sometimes that's quite simple, that it's simply not offered at one university or the other. So, you know, you're limited by that. If it is offered at both universities, then often the courses can be quite different. So if you're saying you really like, I don't know, the kind of maths part of a course, then look at how much maths is in it compared to the other university. There are different courses that have different elements, and I think that should be the key focus. And there was a question in the panel about electrical engineering and which one is better, and again it comes down to what is going to suit you better. So of those courses, what are you looking at? When are you specialising? They have different pathways of when you're going to specialise within engineering. So which is your preference? So for which university, it still needs to come down to the course, really. And then moving on to college. So just for anyone that doesn't know, when you apply to Oxford or Cambridge, you also have to select a college within those universities. You actually don't have to select one, you can leave it open, but most people do select one. And the college is essentially where your kind of tutorials and supervisions are going to happen, as well as within your department for your course. But it's also where you live. It's kind of your home, if you like, whilst you're at the university. And most people that I have conversations with try to pick a college on the basis of statistics. So which college is kind of easier to get into than others, but actually it doesn't work like that, because both universities have a pooling system where colleges can kind of switch applicants. So if they've got lots of very good applicants, they will kind of pool some of those so that colleges that have had fewer strong applicants can pick them up. So in theory, if you're a good candidate or a very good candidate and you're showing all these attributes that David described, you should get a place at the university. It just might not be in the college that you picked initially. And some years, and all of these statistics are out there, some years there are colleges that won't have given any offers to direct applicants. So they rejected everybody that applied to them directly, and they only gave offers from the pool. So, you know, applying to that college because it was easier didn't work, because you still weren't good enough for a place and they picked them up elsewhere. So I think college, the main things that should affect college choice are actually the kind of slightly softer factors, I think, and it's taking into account things like location, how big they are, how many students are studying the same thing as you, because that gives you an indication of the provision there. Do they offer accommodation? What's the food like? Those sound like silly things, but actually if you're going to be living there for 3 years or maybe 4 years, those softer factors actually come into play more so than the statistics, because you can't really play those when the pooling system exists.
Brilliant, thank you. I just want to move on now to wider reading and exposure to new information within your chosen subject. And David, I thought if you could just give a sort of sense of what you feel the role of wider reading and enrichment is when it comes to your Oxbridge application.
Well, it's interesting, thank you. Yes, it's such an important part. If you think about, I'd like to take, I'm thinking of, you know, on my feet here, but if we take two quite distinct subjects, let's take physics and let's take modern languages. If you want to read either of those at Oxford or Cambridge, it's probable that physicists won't necessarily do so much extra reading, at least in terms of pages read, because that's the nature of the subject. But they obviously are going to make an equivalent additional investment in their subject as part of a way of, it's not telling, it's showing those who will be reading their aptitude tests, if they're making an application, those who will be interviewing them, that they have this pull to read this subject, they have this hunger to read this subject. Now, in both physics and modern languages, I think for most candidates, the inspiration for what to study is going to come probably on the basis of what you've been doing during what is in the UK generally called the lower sixth, or the first year sixth form, or year 12, or whatever it may be. It's likely to be subjects you've been studying at that particular point at a more advanced level than at GCSE, which actually may give you some inspiration. It may be you've been reading the novels of Marcel Pagnol. It may be that you've been looking at fluid mechanics. in both cases, if these are things which, not just you've done them, so I better do some more about them, if these are things which have actually forged some kind of interest in your own mind, well, then I think we have the beginnings of a game plan. How do we take it further? Probably you go to your teacher and say, is there something I could read? Hopefully the teacher might have done that. Or is there something I can study? Is there, is there something on YouTube that's worth looking at? We're all a bit subject to lockdown at the moment. So that, I think, we're all dependent on the internet to that extent when it comes to this outreach. Obviously, I think what happens next, you don't get credit for having watched a lecture on fluid mechanics or having read a novel of Albert Camus because he's not on the syllabus. You don't get credit for that. It's what connections it helps you to make. If I've read the novels of Marcel Pagnol and it's inspired me to go to those of Saint-Exupéry, and actually I'm forging a link between the two and I'm able to contrast styles, not because somebody has told me, that's potentially quite interesting and real. And of course, we can make limitless analogies with physics or any other subject. I also think quite strongly, and I hope this is serviceable for families watching the webinar today, this period between May and, I would say, September time, when year 13 starts, the last year, when people are going to be thrown back into the intensity of the syllabus, hopefully back at school, but whether or not they are, they're still going to have all the syllabus to cope with. Between May and September time is a very serious time when individual students must make the decision for themselves, yes, I am going to invest. Our job as parents and teachers is to support that, but the decision belongs to the student.
Brilliant, thank you. Jenny, just following on from the sort of enrichment and reading, where should students look for book and articles and podcasts? Where, there's so much information out there. How do they know where to start and what's going to be the most sort of effective?
Yes, I think what David said is exactly true. If you're reading or you're engaged with something, you should really be inspired by that, which kind of guides you towards new suggestions and resources. So I think a lot of it comes from what you've currently done. And if you're genuinely interested or passionate about the subject, that should lead you to other sources of information. But of course, it's not always as easy as that, and you might need a starting point. And I think a lot of courses for Oxbridge have reading lists and suggestions. So actually that's potentially a good place to start. They will give you initial reading lists to have a go at, but it is about quality and not quantity. So it's about engaging with fewer of those that genuinely really interest you, rather than trying to read everything and then listing that you've read everything on your personal statement. Ultimately, you should just be engaging, and then that should lead you on. Maybe look at the references. Who are they talking about? And then go on to read or watch or listen to more of that. I think the other part, which applies to some courses more than others, is kind of relevant, up-to-date research. So if you're looking at something like engineering or maybe more STEM-related subjects, that kind of up-to-date, cutting-edge research is quite important. And I think you can get that through publications, things like The Economist or New Scientist. So there are lots of good kind of easy reads, if you like, that might get you going on what those new things are. Economics is a good example now, where at interview, it's highly likely they might ask you something about the COVID-19 effect, what effect is that having on the economy? So you need to be kind of trying to keep up to date with things. And there are also some great research council resources. So in the UK, lots of research councils give funding to lots of different things, and they have great websites which kind of tell you where they're putting their money, and they're quite a good place just to keep up to date with what's going on, just so that you're aware of recent kind of ongoings. And then the final thing I would say is that lots of universities, not just Oxford and Cambridge, have great websites with lots of information on. So they will have online lectures, podcasts. So you can search those, look up Imperial, LSE, UCL. They all have really good resources, and you should be making use of those to kind of engage with what's going on in your in your course. But as David said, it should end up leading you through. So you should be engaged by what you've read or listened to. If you're not engaged by it, then maybe you're potentially looking into the wrong course if it doesn't kind of guide you through to other suggestions.
Brilliant. I just, before I ask the next question, I just wanted to say we have had quite a lot of questions in the chat. Some of these will come into other sections of the questions we've already set out, and any of the others we'll try and answer at the end. And as I said at the beginning, if we don't get to them, we will make sure that we can answer them outside of this webinar. So please don't worry, we will get to them at some stage. Jenny, I just wanted to go through a little bit on admissions assessments and thinking about if a course does have an admissions assessment, how should an applicant prepare for that?
So the admissions assessments are all designed to kind of test how you're thinking, really. So they're designed to be difficult and they're designed to be challenging. So preparing in the same way that you might for a GCSE or an A-level doesn't really work, because they're looking at how you think about things rather than simply the information that you have inside your head. So that said, though, both universities actually provide an awful lot of information about what these tests are. So a great place to start is on the relevant website. So for each course, they will tell you what admissions test you will need to take, and then there's a link to a page that will tell you about that admissions test. So the first place to start is to look at that information, look at what the test consists of, what's the structure, what's the content, and start looking at familiarising yourself with the test itself, because that will ultimately help. For some assessments, predominantly the STEM ones, there's actually a syllabus as well, which kind of tells you roughly what the content is going to be. Now, of course, the questions are going to be quite difficult, so it's not as simple as learn these and you'll know, but it gives you an idea of the content, and it's a great idea to compare that with what you studied at school. And I think that particularly applies if schools are closed, because it might be that you haven't covered all of those topics, whereas they plan those syllabus on the assumption that you will have studied most of the topics. So cross-check that and make sure that you fill any gaps before you look at past papers. And then the final thing I would say is that a lot of them don't have mark schemes, or the mark schemes aren't as prescriptive as you might normally expect, and this is often when you might need some external help. So having a kind of expert tutor to actually guide you through what these questions are actually asking in terms of your thinking and what they want to say can really help, because that will develop your thinking skills and your way of answering the test, which ultimately will also help you at interview as well. So that's a great thing to do, and you know, Keystone has lots of kind of good tutors that help many students throughout every summer, and we can do all of that online as well, which at the moment helps hugely. So yeah, that's what I would say. I don't know if David's got anything to add on that.
I agree with that. I mean, there's a creative tension, isn't there? They're trying to find out how well you think on your feet, and as Jenny rightly says, it's not just about, you know, the kind of information you may have amassed, and yet at the same time some of it is susceptible to intervention. I think the important thing to remember, a bright candidate who's focused on the task, when they are able to look at past papers, even something like the TSA, which is the most elusive of all tests, and I think is absolutely impossible to tutor for as far as I can work out, even there, it helps to go on the websites and look at past TSA papers. You get a sense of what, even if you can't do it terribly well, you get a sense of what may be required. Yeah, so don't treat those assessment tests in the same way as A-levels and IB and all the rest, but at the same time, familiarise yourself with what's out there.
Brilliant, thank you. I just wanted to move on to the personal statement, because obviously it's a really core part of the UCAS application. But when you're going for Oxbridge, David, what do you think an Oxbridge personal statement looks like, you know, in comparison with a regular personal statement?
The difference isn't as absolute as it might appear, for one very particular reason, which is that most credible Oxford and Cambridge applicants are also applying for other top universities. And so I think probably the difference is more what perhaps that upper tier of, we could argue about how many, but 6 or 8 top UK universities are wanting. Mm. My rule of thumb, and I'm hesitating to be as prescriptive as this, is what they want is about, it's 4,000 characters, isn't it, which is usually about 660 odd words. And I find my clients, particularly over the last 6 years, when I've been doing a lot of this at this time of years, it's worth saying that about 80% of it, 85% of it should be academically based. I think a personal statement for a good personal statement for an Oxford application anticipates a good Oxbridge interview. It is overwhelmingly showing that you are absorbed by the academic focus of what the life at the university is, and that you can actually engage in it credibly. That's the main point. But I think that applies to Imperial, LSE, and we can go on with another, Warwick, whatever, we can go on with other universities like that. Absolutely.
And on that subject of the sort of academic focus of the personal statement, we've had a few questions in the chat asking whether extracurricular achievements have any relevance on an Oxbridge personal statement. What would you say to that?
Right. Again, it would be nice to give a very kind of absolute answer. The short answer is a very little, but not none. Let me explain this. We know perfectly well that in the US and the US colleges, it has an enormous influence. One can be admiring of that or skeptical of that. That isn't really relevant here. If you get a candidate who has, for instance, let's take a very simple example, played very, very good football or rugby or hockey or netball, and have played it well. You do learn a lot from that when you're reading a personal statement. And Oxford and Cambridge Don will feel just the same as you or I might when we do that. Particularly, it's not just that they're talented, it suggests an ability to commit, to participate, to organise themselves, to multitask. You learn something from that. And I find, on the basis of the, long experience I've had sitting in these interviews, yeah, I find that's helpful. But does it come near actually, changing my mind if they're not up to par with the academic subject? Not even remotely. We've also got to be, it's an academically based decision, overwhelmingly academically based. We've also got to be careful, and there are 2 areas I'd strike a note of caution, and nobody must feel despondent when they hear me say this. Sometimes you get very, very good oarsmen or oarswomen, people who've been very, very good at rowing. Oxford and Cambridge are nervous of accepting people as undergraduates who are going to be so busy on their rowing. I mean, college rowing is great. Even I rowed in college, shows how unserious it is back in the day. But university rowing, which is not something I was ever going to go near, that takes a huge amount of time. Be careful. The other, and perhaps the more common example, is theatre. It's great to act a bit here and there, but university dons at Oxford and Cambridge are very nervous of anything which claims to actually take the attention away from them and their subjects. So be a bit careful there.
Great, thank you. And just in terms of the drafting of the personal statement, Jenny, obviously this is usually a good time to get started in any case, but now people are at home and may have less contact time with their schools, so a bit more time to work on it. How would you recommend people get started drafting their personal statements?
Again, I've said before that the universities have a lot of information actually on their websites, which kind of confirms what David has just said. So both Oxford and Cambridge are asking for the commitment, the interest, the engagement. They kind of say that they're less interested in the other extracurricular things, but it's all about the engagement. So I think if you don't know where to start, I always think a good starting point, which I kind of say to students, is to give examples of why you want to do the course with some evidence. So what you've done, maybe it could be a text you've read, it could be work experience, maybe it's a debate you had at school, or you know, something that your parents did when you were a child. Reasons for why, with examples, and just list them to start with. And then I think once you've got enough kind of evidence, then you start to build that together. And that comes into also listing things that are academic achievements, so what you're doing at school, how that links. Other things that you're doing, like if you're applying for philosophy, you know, are you in the philosophy club at school? Those kind of things. And just keep records and notes, almost in bullet point form. And then what that means is that then when you come to draft it, you can start to weave all of that together. But I find if you just sit with a blank piece of paper, it's very hard to just write free-flowing open paragraphs. Whereas if you've kept records of all of those things, when you're reading, doing all the engagement with material that David talked about, if you're keeping notes whilst you're doing all of that, it means that it's much easier when it comes to actually writing it. And I think the other thing to say would be to make use of help as well. So teachers, again, at the moment remotely, maybe they'll be able to help you, or advisors. So, you know, David does a lot of work on personal statements with clients he works with. You know, Keystone also helps with that as well. So I think use the help out there, but start by just getting little chunks down, and then you can start to weave it together once you've got an idea of what you want to say.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just going to move straight on to interviews, because we've had a few questions again in the chat about interviews. I think people are always fairly curious and apprehensive about what an interview at Oxbridge actually means. So David, if you could start with just sort of, I know this is pretty broad, but what is an Oxbridge interview like?
An Oxbridge interview is usually about 25 minutes. It can be shorter or longer, but that I think is a fair overall understanding of how long it would be. Usually with 2 or 3 Oxford or Cambridge teachers, as they tend to be called fellows of colleges, who are in every case academics. These are people who have tenure in the college which you're applying. They have a research a history and a series of publications, usually of their own. So they will also be, or they will include people who will actually be teaching the undergraduates, the tutors of the undergraduates. It is overwhelmingly academic. It's a form of question and answer. Depending a little bit on the subject, it's either entirely based on what the questions I am asking you now and you are having to answer in real time. Sometimes, and it depends also on the college as well as on the subject, they will give you something to look at just before the interview which you couldn't possibly have prepared for, and that will form part of the focus of the interview. They may draw off your personal statement, and they may well draw off any aptitude tests that you've actually done, essays or problems you've answered. You didn't do terribly well in that, how about that? I think Oxford and Cambridge have become far more reliable over the past 2 or 3 decades, as maybe as much as that, at actually not being self-indulgent in interviews. I think they set out to be businesslike, welcoming in a kind of non-specific way to everybody who comes in. They fully understand that many applicants are not experienced with the interview dynamic, and therefore I think they are trained to, and they want to be patient and not to hassle people, make them feel inferior. Not at all. You occasionally hear the odd horror story, but it's pretty rare, and I think you can be confident that it won't. On the other hand, they're not going to deal in platitudes. They're not going to let you off the hook. And they will move in very, very quickly into an area where they feel you have perhaps claimed more than you can actually deliver, and they won't let it go until they've worked out exactly how much you can or can't deliver. And they are looking to see you struggle a little bit, not out of sadism, but because they want to see actually the kind of the base metal, how tough and how clear-headed you are under pressure. It is a degree there is an exacting business, and it's in its own way, it's pretty intense. And so you need to be tough and quite determined. I hope that's something of an answer. I find it's a very, very positive experience. If I can also say, it is susceptible. It is susceptible, rather like those assessment tests with the TSA, it's susceptible to practice. Rather like for a top job interview, it is susceptible to practice. And Keystone does it, I do a lot of it, that kind of thing. Yeah, definitely.
Great. And Jenny, I don't know if you have anything to add about the interviews themselves, but it'd be great if you could add if you have any additions, and also if you could just give us a sort of brief overview of how best people could prepare for the interviews as well.
So yeah, just to follow on from what David said, is that I think a lot of the interviews are course dependent as well. So it's worth, I think a good preparation point is again looking at what Oxford and Cambridge say the interview will be like. They're pretty good now, they're pretty transparent with videos. So the Oxford website has videos, the different course pages will have examples of interview questions potentially, interviews with students that have done it. There's also a lot on YouTube. If you kind of Google Oxford interview for physics, there will be lots of people on there talking about what their interviews were like. So I think there's actually quite a lot of information that can be course specific. So to start with for preparation, I would say have a look at all of that. Read what's there. It's there for a reason and it'll give you some sort of idea. And I think a lot of the rest of the preparation is things that we've talked about already, like having the kind of reading, the enrichment, maybe having some help on the aptitude tests with a subject expert. All of that is building you up to be able to hold an academic conversation with an expert in their field. Of course, you can also have kind of direct preparation, which, as David said, he does, and we also do, and also some mock interviews. So nearer the time, you know, with people you don't know, that can ask you questions in a way that you would be asked at the interview. Because if you know them already, if it's a tutor that's already been preparing you, then there's a kind of element of them potentially being a little bit nicer to you. Whereas actually, if it's a stranger, it gives you a much better sense of what that process would be. So I think, yeah, key things would be making sure you know what's out there in terms of information, having some sessions to help you prepare, and then having some mock interviews nearer the time. But they are looking for, as David said, a discussion. You know, they don't want a student actually that knows everything. They want somebody that has potential, that is willing to engage in an academic conversation with them, and potentially say when you don't know something, you know, actually,
Quite right.
Let's talk about that. Can you, you know, the Oxford interviews that I've been in, you know, some of the best ones were the ones that held their hands up and said, I actually don't really know, like how can, and they almost worked through the questions kind of with the interviewer. And actually that's exactly what an Oxford tutorial is like. So that is far more appealing to a fellow than somebody that sits there and either doesn't admit they don't know or acts like they know everything.
Brilliant. I know that we're going to touch on work experience, but actually I thought it might be helpful if we could just quickly address a couple of the questions in the chat. I know we're getting a little bit close to time being up, but given that we have our office in Singapore, I thought this question might apply to quite a few people that are watching this webinar today. It's about deferring entry. So if someone was looking for 2023 entry, when should their son apply? Because he's going to be doing his military service in Singapore, currently in lower sixth. What would the advice be there, and how would he keep things and his interest in the subject going whilst he's having to do military service?
May I have a go at saying, just because it's come up with a lot of my clients, you know, some who've been in Singapore, this very question. And it's a problem. Guess what? Oxford and Cambridge and the UK university system is a little bit cumbersome when it comes to this, because they don't allow a 2-year deferment. You can apply for a year's deferment. So that if somebody, instead of somebody in the lower six now who would normally be going to university perhaps in 2021, if they were leaving straight from school, they could apply to 2022 but not to 2023. The main answer to the question is that you apply a year later. And now that would mean in most cases, this young man that we're talking about, he'll be starting his national service. He'll probably be in the heavy time of the square bashing and the military training. So not an ideal way, not an ideal basis from which to be putting forward an Oxford application. In which case you track back, and I would say, and I've done this with a good many clients, is we work together on getting a personal statement, the application all sorted out as far as we humanly can before he begins national service, but submit it at the normal time in the autumn of 2021 for entry in 2023. You could delay that by a year and apply in autumn 2022. Now, that's the procedural point. There are two caveats. One is, I have known a couple of occasions where you can actually approach an individual college, probably best done by a third party, and say, look, we're Singaporean, he needs to do national service. How would it be if we put in for a year's deferment, but in reality, he's not going to be able to go up in a year. And if you offer him a place, he won't be able to take it for another year. I certainly know of one case in a Cambridge college where they actually very recently said, yeah, that's fine, you can have 2 years. They didn't make it formal, but it happened. So if that were to be a case of somebody who wanted that, and please, whether it's with Keystone or with me, it doesn't matter, I think that might be something that could be considered. The other point is that you asked the other question, how do you keep interest going? That's all important. And that's a whole other question. It's nothing to do with national service. It's actually, I mean, we're going to go back to what Jenny has been saying, what I've been saying. It's about, you've got to make that decision for yourself, and it's got to matter. There are ways in which Keystone or I can support that, I think, quite aptly, but it's got to be wished for by the student. Long answer, I hope it helps.
That's brilliant. I'm sure that's really helpful. I imagine there are others in that situation. One quick one for Jenny, maybe. A question saying daughter was unsuccessful following interview at Oxford. Can we advise what she should do if she wants to reapply?
So that will also depend on whether, I guess, they ask for any feedback. So actually you can kind of request feedback from colleges as to maybe what area you fell down on potentially. So that would be my first piece of advice if they have or haven't done that. And in terms of reapplying, I mean, it's the same process really. You just need to make sure that you are, you know, kind of more of whatever they were looking for than you were the last time. So it could be that the course choice wasn't quite right, for example. So it's that thing of, did you pick the right thing to be interviewed for in the first place? And then if you are sticking with the same course, then I think it's all the other things that we've just talked about. So it's preparing in the same way that you did the last time, but that commitment and passion and engagement is what they're looking for. So maybe that potentially didn't come through, and that's what I would suggest that they work on.
Sorry, can I say two things there? They must have good A-level results. If they applied before A-level or IB, they've got to have credible IB or A-level results to actually support a reapplication. On the other hand, Oxford and Cambridge are excellent. They fully understand that good candidates may not have been, as Jenny says, in the right course or sufficiently, they've quite got it together being that much younger. There is no prejudice against candidates reapplying. There's no stigma attached to that. My advice would be to apply to a different college. Not because the colleges are prejudiced against you, they're not, but because I think for a candidate, it usually actually means it feels like, you know, we're giving ourselves a fresh chance here.
Great, and this is not really connected to that, but you did just mention IB and A-levels. So I just have one question in the chat saying, do Oxbridge have a preference there between IB or A-level? I assume this is people maybe thinking about a school switch for sixth form. Would they have any preference out for one or the other, do you think? Either if you can answer that.
No, I mean, I think Oxford and Cambridge are more used to A-level, but they're very good and diligent. No, I don't, Jenny, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to agree. And I think on the website, you know, when they're giving the requirements, it's very clear that they've got offers for both A-level and IB. And as long as you've got the subject-specific requirements, that's the main thing, is that do you do the A-level that they want, and do you do the IB higher level subjects that they want? That's the primary factor really, otherwise there's no preference.
I'm just going to ask one more question from the chat, and I appreciate there are a couple more that we haven't managed to get to, and we will make sure that we contact you to get those answered, so please do not worry. The final question is, how do they see private school versus state school? I don't know who wants to start with that one, maybe David.
Okay. Oxford and Cambridge are interested overwhelmingly and above all in rewarding talent. I get a little bit, I'm gonna come clean on this. I get a little bit irritated when I see a small coterie of independent school users, get teachers, and I was one for a long time, parents, kids, whatever, who imagine they're seriously disadvantaged because they're not at state schools. It's a myth, and it's not a very agreeable one. Oxford and Cambridge are very determined, and I think it may lead to a slight bias in this way, to give where they can. They will try to interview state school applicants where they can. If they think it's just not credible, they won't interview them either. A private school applicant, particularly one from perhaps a top private school, you can't get Oxford or Cambridge to admit this, but I'm pretty clear it's right. If they're not scoring at a reasonably credible level, it may be easier to exclude them for the interview. Once I think they're at interview, no. I think it's absolute even Stevens. And I just don't accept this. I think it's a comforting myth for certain people. I think they work very hard to be fair-minded, both universities.
Yeah, I agree. I think it gives you maybe a step up into the interview process potentially, because they're trying to even out the playing field. But again, in the kind of interviews that I've been in, to be honest, the professor that was sat next to me didn't even know where they'd come from anyway.
It's not that interesting.
Yeah, they don't look at that information because all they're interested in is the person that's in front of them and whether they are impressive or not. So yeah, if you're good enough in the interview, you will get a place, and if you're not, you're not.
Brilliant. I'd love to end with just a final top tip from both of you of what you would be doing perhaps if you were looking at applying to Oxbridge yourselves at this stage. You're at home, you've got your online lessons, but what else would you be doing if it were you? What would be your number one priority?
At this stage, at my advanced age, the idea of applying is just terrifying. But imagining that it was young again, I think I wasn't very good at this when I was a youngster, but I'd be saying, I don't want to kid myself. I want to take every care to choose the right subject, and to try in the personal statement and in the preparation, and if I'm lucky enough to get to interview, I want to be sort of working with absolute honesty to work out what it is that gives me such a thrill and what it is that the connections that I can make. That's what I think.
Yeah, mine would be to embrace the time that you have in the summer, because actually you potentially might have more time this year than normal, you know, travel plans, who knows what will happen. So I think making use of that time, and yes, you might lose out potentially on being able to do a bit of work experience because things are closed, but actually you can make use of the time for all of the other things that we've discussed. And I think if you're someone that needs a bit of structure, planning it out a little bit, you know, making time to read, making time to watch a TED talk, making time to kind of listen to a podcast, structuring it in that way will help you get started. And then in theory, the ball should roll from there and you should be really interested. I think if you find all of those things really arduous, you've probably made either the wrong course choice, or you're maybe not an Oxbridge candidate, because the Oxbridge candidates that get the places are the students that are doing all of this because they genuinely are really interested in and love this preparation process to some extent.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both. I think that's been really informative. Obviously, we have had some questions that we haven't managed to get to, but as I said, we will address those post-webinar. For anyone who's looking at Oxbridge alongside US applications, we have a webinar next Thursday at 2 o'clock UK time in the afternoon. So please do sign up for that if you're looking at going or thinking about US applications. But again, thanks so much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for asking us. Lovely.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.